Hi everyone, this is Melissa Keaton, also known as MKT Photography. Today I'm working on a composite image. I'm going to be using this background right here, and I have a few photos from my compositing workshop that I did on Sunday of our lovely model Courtney, and I'm going to be putting her into that background. Now, as you can see, I have pulled out a number of different images here. I don't expect that I will be using all of them, but these are the ones that stood out to me from the images that I shot. The first one is what I will start with, I think, because I really like Courtney's expression here and her pose. I just like that wistful sort of feeling that she's giving there to go with this background. So I did pull out a couple of shots where we were playing with Courtney's skirt that I really liked. I had thought to maybe put one of these into the composite as well, but I probably won't do that simply because her posture here and her pose, her whole body language and expression is more of a solemn sort of one, and I just don't feel that having the skirt flying out this much really makes sense with that shot, so I'll probably leave those out. However, this image here I pulled out because of Courtney's hair with a fan just blowing it back off her shoulder a little bit. I quite like that, so I will probably use this image just for her hair and put it into this shot. Okay, so the first thing I have to do is just get this image out from Lightroom and into Photoshop. So I'm going to right click on my image, I'm going to select Edit In, and I'm going to select Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. We can do Edit in Photoshop, but I'm going to choose to open it as a smart object because doing that allows me to work with the image as a raw file, and that means I can do a lot of edits in Photoshop non-destructively that I wouldn't be able to otherwise. So now that the image is in Photoshop, I'm going to start cutting Courtney out of the background. And the way that I do this, I will usually always start with a quick selection tool. And you need a brush size that, is smaller than what you want selected, but, is a reasonable size for how much you want selected. So I think around this size should be fine. And with the quick selection tool, you can see the little plus in the cursor there. And that means whenever I click on the image, I'm going to be adding to my selection. So I want the plus cursor anywhere where I'm clicking on Courtney, and if I go over the background, if I get a selection that selects part of the wall, for instance, I'm going to be using the subtract mode on my quick select tool. However, I haven't done that yet, so I'm just going to keep going with the plus sign. So you can see that where her shadow falls, it has selected that part as well. So I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to change my quick selection tool from the plus sign to the minus sign mode, which you can do in the options bar underneath the menu up here. So now you can see the little the little minus symbol in the cursor, and that means I am going to click and it is going to subtract from my selection. So I don't want the floor in my selection here, and you can see that it is getting subtracted pretty reasonably from my selection. It may have a problem in some of these darker areas because the way the algorithm works, it really needs contrasting colors to be able to pick up an edge. And I just don't really have that in these darker shadow areas. So instead of using the quick selection tool, I'm going to try it with the magnetic lasso tool. Now this tool, by default, it does not automatically just add to your selection. So what you need to do is change the mode of the tool. If you go up to the options bar underneath the main menu, you can see that this second button here will add to the selection. So I want to click that, and I'm going to go around this little heel part, and hopefully it will pick that up reasonably well. So I'm going to click to set a point for my selection and then keep going around the heel. It's not doing too badly actually, which is good. Now as for the rest of it, I now need to switch the tool to subtract from selection, which is the third button up here. And then I can just click and trace the mouse around the edge of the skirt. And when I get to the end, I'm just going to subtract from the rest of it like that, and do a similar thing with the skirt up here. Magnetic lasso tool is very good for selecting things when the quick selection tool does not work as well. So if you find that the quick selection tool isn't giving you the results that you want, definitely try the magnetic lasso tool. It picks up the edges pretty well, but obviously it does take a bit longer to use because you have to manually trace the edges yourself. Now I just realized that there is part of Courtney's skirt showing at the back here, which I did not initially realize. So I'm going to just add that part in again using the lasso tool, and I'm going to switch to the subtract from selection mode just to get rid of this little piece on the bottom of the shoe here, a little piece of the floor that I missed. Alright, so this part of her skirt as well, you can see the selection missed a little bit. So I'm going back to add to selection. You can see the plus sign on my cursor, and I'm just going to draw that part of the skirt in that was missed. You can see it's a very similar shade to the background, which is why the quick selection tool did not pick that up. The selection at this point does not have to be absolutely perfect. We are going to refine it once we get a rough, fairly decent selection. And once we actually put Courtney on the background and start making edits, I will have to refine the selection again as well. So the shortcut key to toggle between the plus and the minus modes, if you hold down Alt, you can see my cursor changes to the minus symbol, and then I can subtract from my selection. Or if you hold down the Shift key, then it changes to the plus symbol and I can add to my selection there. I am using the freehand lasso tool right now, but this is the same for the magnetic lasso tool, which I just switched to there. If I hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, I can just trace, add to the selection automatically. And if I hold down the Alt key instead, you can see the plus sign changes to the minus sign. Alright, so I think that's fairly decent. There's a bit here still. I'm going to use the magnetic lasso tool. With the Shift key held down, I have the plus symbol. So I'm just going to trace around this black ribbon here. And then I'm going to hold down the Alt key to get my subtract mode and trace in the wall that is showing here and get rid of that from my selection. If you accidentally double click and you find that it's drawing another selection like this that you obviously don't want, you can just hit the escape key and that will disappear. If you happen to not be in the plus or minus modes, I just changed it to the default, which is a new selection. If you click, you'll find that the previous selection you made disappears. So you just be careful of that and hit escape to get out of that and you'll get your selection back. Or if you drew a selection that overwrote your previous one, just hit undo or come back to your history panel and just go back a step until you get your selection again. There we go. So now that I have a good selection around Courtney, I'm going to come to my layers panel and come down to add a layer mask. And when I just click that with a selection in place, it is going to cut her out very quickly in one click. You can see her hair here, I can see the wall through it. So what we're going to do is double click on the layer mask and make sure you're double clicking on the layer mask thumbnail, which is the black and white thumbnail, and we go to select and mask. This will bring up a new window which you can use to refine your selection. Now you can see everywhere that is red is what is not selected. I have some default values on here under global refinements. You can see smoothing, smooths jagged edges, feather will soften the edge, and contrast and shift edge, they also help to refine the edge and make it a little bit more precise. If I just reset these values, you will see how much sharper the edge of my selection is. Whereas once I bump smooth up to 2, the edge has gotten a little bit smoother. If I bump feather up to 1, it softens the edge a little bit. And then let me put her on black. Okay, so I just changed the mode to put her on black because I expect my when I do my composite, I'm going to actually darken the background a fair bit, and just changing the view mode to black when you are refining your selection just makes it easier to see if there are any white edges around her. I actually don't see much at all, so I'm pretty satisfied with that. But however, we still do need to take care of her hair here a little bit. Now, Select and Mask has a Refine Edge brush tool, which is supposed to be helpful for this. If you don't have Select and Mask option, I should have mentioned it is called Refine Edge in the properties window of your layer mask. And in the Refine Edge window, you do also have this Refine Edge brush. I believe it is toggled on by default. And then you can just brush over parts of your model and it will try to refine the edge. It's particularly useful for hair, for getting those finer details of the hair. Sometimes it doesn't always work very well. For some reason, I find that the old Refine Edge tool was just a lot better than the Select and Mask feature that they've got. I really don't like Select and Mask at all. It just doesn't seem to give as good a result. I'm not going to worry too much about Courtney's hair though in this image because I'm going to be taking her hair from that other photo that I had. So I'm just going to hit OK, and it should have applied to my layer mask. As I mentioned, this Select and Mask button here is also called Refine Edge in different versions of Photoshop. I'm just going to go back into Select and Mask. I forgot to mention one thing. Under Output Settings at the bottom, make sure that you have Output to Layer Mask selected and not Output to Selection. If you output to layer mask, it will automatically change your layer mask based on the refinements you made. But if you output to selection and hit OK, you will see that you get your selection edge again. And it probably won't have updated your layer mask. So just make sure that you have that output to selection to your layer mask and not to selection. Now you can see easily here that that Refine Edge brush tool took out big chunks of her hair. So I'm going to actually go to my layer mask, switch to my brush tool, and have my foreground color to white, my opacity and flow both to 100%. And I will reduce my brush size, which can be accessed up here, down to a smaller size. And I'm just going to paint back in the solid parts of her hair. Now, before I take Courtney into my background, I am going to go back to Lightroom and get my hair photo. I'm going to right click, edit in, open a smart object in Photoshop, and I'm going to add her hair right now. I think I'm going to double click on my smart object, and it opens up Camera Raw, and I'm going to actually crop this image in just so I just have her head here. Then I will come in and make a rough selection. Let's go back to the plus, to my add selection. I'm going to deselect this selection by going up to select, deselect, or you can see it's just Control D, the shortcut for that. And I'm going to just use the quick selection tool. See, that went too far, so I'm going to undo that. Use the quick selection tool to try and just select her hair. Did it again. This is being a pain now. So instead of quick selection tool, I'm going to use magnetic lasso tool. I'm just going to hold down shift to get my plus symbol and trace roughly, very roughly around her hair. Oh, and around the rest of her too. It doesn't matter so much about the rest of her, but this should make it a little bit easier to place her hair into the previous shot. I don't really care about this bit here, so I'm just going to use the lasso tool and subtract that part off. Add my layer mask to cut her out, and I will refine using select and mask. So double click on my layer mask, select and mask or refine edge. And I will use the same settings as I had previously, and then use the refine edge brush tool just to try and get rid of these bits of the wall that are behind her hair. Once again, you can see it is taking big chunks out of her actual hair, which I want to keep. It's not helpful, and this also is not very helpful, but I'll just stick with that for the moment. And then I'm going to use just my brush tool to paint back in those big chunks that it removed. Alright, that's not bad. I'm going to zoom out. And now I'm going to take this image and put it into my other photo of Courtney. And I'm quite literally just going to drag this layer into my other file. So with the move tool selected, we click on Courtney, and you can see I can drag her around, and then we go drag her into this file, not releasing the mouse button just yet, and then bring down until the cursor changes to this plus symbol, and let go of the mouse, and there she is. So I'm going to try and line up her part, so I'm going to put my mouse there and just sit her over the top like that. I think she is actually a little bit smaller in my headshot here, so I'm actually going to make it a little bit bigger. I just went to Control T, free transform under the edit menu, and now I'm just going to slightly increase her size here, just until her head is about the same size, just like that. Looks okay. And now that we have done that, I am going to my layer mask, I'm going to my brush tool, change the foreground color to black, and I'm going to paint away the parts of her that I don't need. So I'm also going to change the hardness of my brush, make it a little bit harder, just to make it a little bit easier to brush out these parts of her. So all I really want, really, is just her hair in this image. Now, you can see I have a bit of a problem here because her hair in the original shot is covering part of her face. So I can't just, this isn't as easy as I was hoping it would be. But that's alright, because I can work this, if I'm careful, I can work it to still blend it in. It's just a matter of trying to find the sweet spot of where the two images look like they are seamless. So this is looking okay. I could just do that. but I don't really like how messy it looks here where her ear is. I think that will do for now, and I'll move on. So now we have all these layers that make up Courtney. I'm going to select them all by clicking on the top layer, holding down shift and clicking on the lowest layer, and then put them into a group. So I put them into a group just to keep them all together. I'm going to rename the group, rename it as Courtney. Press enter. And now I'm going to use the move tool, because once you have it selected, you have to make sure that the group is selected. And then I can use my move tool, click on Courtney and drag, and it will take the entire group into my background. So now that she's in here, I don't need my original images, so I'm just going to close them out. This will help Photoshop's performance. And before I go any further, I'm going to go File, Save As. Photoshop does crash sometimes, so it is important to save regularly. So, Courtney is too big right now. With the group selected, I'm using Ctrl-T, and I'm going to drag her around, change her size, and place her in the image. Let's try that. Okay, so she stands out like a sore thumb, and the biggest, most obvious reason right now is because the background is really washed out and she is not. There are two things you can do. The first thing is either to change the background or to change Courtney. I think it will be easier to change the background and bring back some of the contrast. So I'm going to use a curves adjustment layer just above my background layer. So I select my background layer, I hit curves, it will put the adjustment layer above the background, meaning that it won't affect Courtney, it will only affect the background. Now you can see the data on the histogram is showing that there is a huge chunk of blacks and shadows missing. So I am actually going to bring those back in by clicking on the little square in the bottom left corner and then just dragging it across almost to where the data starts in the image. And you can see that the contrast is a lot better in the background now. It doesn't quite match Courtney because Courtney is missing a bit of contrast as well, but it's certainly better. And with the curves adjustment, I think it has affected the color. So I'm going to change my blend mode to luminosity just to see, yes, there was a difference. So when you adjust the curves, it does also impact the color of the image, especially if you adjust curves dramatically. So selecting the luminosity blend mode just means that it is only going to affect the brightness and the contrast and not the colors in the image. So if I go back to normal, you will see the image is a lot more vibrant and yellow, but if I switch to luminosity, it has really only affected the brightness of the image. When I toggle off the adjustment layer, and if you look at the yellows and the reds here, you can see that the color is pretty much the same now that the blend mode is set to luminosity. I think that's a lot better. The color levels in the background now actually pretty much suit the color levels on Courtney herself, and the contrast appears to match pretty well as well. So that's great. She does still look like she is just stuck on there though. And the reason for that is because she is casting no shadow and the floor is really quite bright, whereas Courtney's feet are quite dark. So what we want to do now, I actually want to darken the floor. So I'm just going to zoom in a little and apply another curves adjustment layer on top. But this time I'm only going to look at the floor and I'm going to make it darker. So I'm going to click on the grid here, the graph, and just bring the curves down. Just looking at the floor for the moment, bringing the curves down just to darken the floor to a point where it kind of looks better in relation to Courtney's feet there. It has darkened the rest of the image quite considerably. however, which I don't think I want, especially around the windows. So with my layer mask selected, I'm going to the brush tool, and with black, I'm going to increase my brush size using the right square bracket and just brush it off. I'm also on 50% opacity. Just brush it off the parts of the image where I don't actually want it to be affected. I'm going to take it a bit off the door as well, just to bring the brightness back in. So I don't mind that it's dark. I actually don't mind that it's darkened the image as a whole either. To me it helps Courtney stand out more, and it does match a little bit better. It was quite bright before, but I am going to take off more of the adjustment of that curve using the brush tool on black and on the layer mask off the windows, because that is where most, well, all the light is coming from. And I do want that to still be relatively bright. Okay, so I do want to adjust the brightness on Courtney as well to make it look like she's more standing in front of the window. I am going to select Courtney's group, add my curves adjustment layer above Courtney, and I'm going to clip it just to Courtney, and I'm going to increase the brightness just like that. Now it has obviously brightened areas that I don't want her to be brighter. I really want it just coming from this window. So with my layer mask selected, I'm going to the brush tool with black, and I'm going to brush off, I think at maybe 50% opacity, and I'm going to brush off from the back of her where I don't want that adjustment to be. So now if I hide that layer and bring it back, you can see she is significantly brighter, and it looks like there is light falling off onto her from the window. Now, having done that, it actually looks to me like her hair is too bright still. So again, I'm going to use curves, clip it to the layer below, and just looking at this region of her hair, I'm actually going to bring the curves down and darken that. Rather, I'm actually going to click on the layer mask and hit invert so that it is entirely black, so it's completely hidden. And then using my brush tool, going to white for the foreground this time, I'm actually going to paint with my brush on white to bring parts of this adjustment layer back in where I want it to be. This is before, this is after. I'm going to put Courtney's shadow in. Her original photo didn't actually have a great deal of shadow because it was very diffused and washed out. There we go. You can see it's mostly going in the opposite direction you would kind of expect. So I probably am going to paint a bit of shadow back here as well. But for now, what I want to do, I want to duplicate my original layer. Because it is a smart object, I'm going to right click on the layer, and I think I will do new smart object for your copy. I'm going to rename this to shadow, and I'm going to drag it down and put it underneath my photo of Courtney, which I'm going to actually rename Courtney. So with my shadow layer, I'm going to remove the layer mask completely, and I am going to add a new layer mask, and I'm going to paint over Courtney's shadow with the black brush. So I've got my brush tool, I'm going to switch it to black, and yes, black hides the parts of the image that you don't want, but in this case it's going to be easier for me to just paint over the shadow part and then invert the mask to reveal it. Because if I go and invert the mask right now so that it's black and everything is hidden, so I can't actually see where the shadow is to brush it back in. So that is the reason that I'm going to do the opposite of what I actually want and have the white layer mask and paint it out to start with. I hope that made sense. Hopefully it will when I do it. So here we go. I'm just going to do this. It doesn't have to be perfect. You'll be able to see that my computer is slowing down significantly right now. I'm not entirely sure why. Okay, so now I have that done. I am going to select my layer mask, click invert. Now I will be able to see the shadow instead of the rest of the background. Obviously it is still just a shadow on a white floor, so I'm going to come to my blend modes and change it from normal to multiply. This is going to add my shadow part and blend it with the background, but obviously you can see the white parts around the edges where I didn't really do, a great job of masking it. So I'm going to actually use my brush tool on the layer mask and change it to black to hide it, and at an opacity of say 30%, and I'm going to erase this section. And then for the rest of it, I will probably just have to paint it in. Now I will create a new layer. I'm going to put it underneath what I am going to rename as Real Shadow. And I'll rename layer 2 as Drawn Shadow. And I'll use a black brush at about 10%. And I'm going to zoom in using the black brush. And I'm just going to draw a bit of black behind her here. Now we want this to actually blend with the floor rather than to be painted on. So I'm actually going to change my normal blend mode to multiply as well. You won't see a huge effect here because it is very light still. If I keep going, things should build up a little bit more. So when you're doing shadows, that's one of the tricks. You really have to keep just building up the shadow. Shadows are very multi-layered sorts of things, and it's very easy to get something that's not realistic, which is why it's best if you can actually just take the real shadow from your original image. It just saves a lot of time and guesswork. So this actually isn't looking too bad to me. I think there should be a bit of darkening on the wall in front of her, so I'm just going to add that in. Not necessarily on the windowsill because the light is coming directly onto there, but just in front of her. She should be blocking some of the light from the left side. This image, the lighting is quite diffused, so you really don't need a lot to make things look fairly realistic. So that now I have added shadow and things, you can actually see, if you look closely at the edge, that there is a white line around her. That is something we're going to need to fix later on. So this is the reason why you don't have to get your selection perfect from the start, because when you drop in your background you may still get that happening. I can guarantee it, actually you will still get that happening. So I'm just going to select my real shadow and my drawn shadow and put them in their own group, which I'm going to rename to shadow. And if I toggle it off and toggle it on, you can see how much more it looks like she is actually standing here in the scene. Shadows are one of the things that people usually forget about when they're doing composites, or they aren't able to create a realistic shadow because they are very hard to do. This is looking pretty good to me. I'm just going to save this again. So I'm just going to stop for the moment and restart things, and hopefully things will speed up when I come back. When you're doing composites, I find it's usually helpful to take a break, because usually that just helps to, I guess, refresh your eyes and perhaps your mind. after you've been staring at this image for so long. Because once I did that, I came back in and realized that Courtney is still way too bright. So I do think that decreasing the brightness of the image before was definitely too much. Alternatively, I could also decrease the brightness on Courtney instead, but I'm going to reduce the opacity of this a little bit and see what happens. Even that has made a difference for sure. I just reduced it from 100 to 85% opacity, and absolutely it's looking better. Now, zoomed out as I am right now, I have just noticed that this image is not symmetrical. So I can actually see the edge of the wall on this side, whereas I can't see it on this side. So I'm going to actually crop it and get rid of that section. I'm not sure if I really like that crop. The main issue with this image is that the door is a prominent feature, especially considering that Courtney is on the right side of the image. So I'm actually kind of thinking of cropping it well in just to make Courtney stand out more and be more prominent in the image. Let's just try this and have a look. So I feel like this is a better crop than this. The rule of thirds has a play in that, but also without this other window there, there's one less bright spot of the frame and also a lot less negative space. So I do think this is better. Another option that I'm thinking would be to actually bring it in and cut the door in half, because doing that absolutely means that the door is less significant because it's not all there. The question is, where do you do it? If you consider rule of thirds, if we have Courtney actually on the third marker, that could be good, although I don't like how much wall is here now. So I could even just push it back like this. Let's try that. It feels like there's still too much space over here compared to the other side. I also feel like there's not enough floor here, so I'm actually going to increase this back to what it was. Okay, that feels better balanced to me. I don't like the handle there though, so I might actually just clean that out a little bit later. Let's have a look. So this is what I have now for the crop. This isn't a good use of the history panel, by the way. You can actually compare your different versions pretty easily, pretty quickly, just by going through the steps that you made. And now that we've done this, without the window on the left side, I can actually reduce the brightness of this left portion of the image to make it even stronger. So I'm going to add my curves adjustment layer to do that above everything else, so that I'm also affecting Courtney, because if I reduce the brightness of this area, it makes sense that the brightness on her left side as well should also go down. So here we have the curves layer. I'm just going to click on the graph and just drag it down. Just reduce the brightness. And obviously I don't want it on a lot of the rest of the image, so I'm going to grab my brush on a black brush, 30% opacity, quite a large brush size I want here, and I'm going to brush off some of that adjustment. So over here I'm actually going to change my opacity up to 100%, and to set it at 100%, you can just press 0 on your numbers at the top of your keyboard. And I'm going to brush that right off. You'll also notice that the door here had a bit of glare in the center. So what I'm going to do now, I want, again, a little bit more of a drop off in brightness on this side. I'm actually going to do that with another curves adjustment layer and decrease the brightness. I'm going to invert the mask now, and I'm going to paint in white on a low opacity just to darken this section just behind her, and also on Courtney herself. Toggling that on and off, you can see the difference it makes. I'm really mostly doing this just because I want Courtney to really stand out as being the thing that's lit by the window. The problem with the door, I want to even out the glare spot there, and the thing that makes that difficult is that glare actually changes the color of the door, so it is a little bit bluer in that section. So I'm going to take a color balance adjustment layer, and with the layer mask I'm going to invert it so that I can paint with white just on this portion of the door that I want it to affect. So just roughly for now. And when I go to my properties panel for color balance, I am going to adjust the colors to take out the blues in that section. So I'm going to take out cyan, bump it up to red, possibly even the shadows. I'll take the blues out as well, make it more red. If I do it really extreme, you can see. Certainly don't need it to be that extreme. And I'm just going to clean up the mask a little bit so that I fade this effect out with a 30% opacity brush on black, just to fade it out along the edges so it really is only targeting the glare spot. Okay, if I toggle that off and now on, hopefully you can see that that has made quite a difference to the glare spot on the door, and it's not as distracting anymore. So I should be able to take my curves adjustment layer. I'm going to set it to luminosity so it doesn't affect the colors, and I'm going to clip it to my color balance layer so it affects the same place that the color change happened. And I'm going to see if I can just reduce the brightness a little bit, just to take that glare down even further. If I turn it off and turn it on again, I'm feeling pretty good about this. The next thing that I would look at is the colors overall in the image. So color is a big part of compositing, because color really changes the mood of a photo and the feeling that, you know, the photo actually produces when you look at it. What I'm going to do right now is group my Courtney layers and the adjustments that I applied just to Courtney, just to tidy up my layers a bit. And I'm going to select the ones that I want to group, click the new group button, rename it to model, and then I'm going to do the same thing with all of my background layers and adjustments. Now I'm going to work on colors. So I'm going to use color balance on top of everything else. And in my opinion, this image has too much yellowy, almost green tones to it. So, especially in the shadows, I'm going to start with the shadows and reduce the greens. And already that is looking much better to me. I don't like green tones in my images. And you really usually don't need a lot of adjustments for these sorts of things, but you do just play around with the sliders until you see something that you like. Looks okay. And then with the midtones, again, I'm going to take out some of those greens and some of the yellows. And then I'm going to go to highlights and do the same thing, except usually you don't want the same colors in your highlights as your shadows. Usually I would put yellows in the shadows, usually I would put blues in the shadows and yellows in the highlights. So mainly the highlights obviously are the window, which you won't see much color effect on the window, but the other highlights are also on Courtney and you will see more of effect on that. Okay, and if I toggle that off and toggle it on again, you can see the big difference in the color tone there. I think it's much better not having all those greens in it. Okay, it is a new day for me. I'm looking at this image with fresh eyes, and straight away what jumps out at me the most is Courtney's hair here. Just looks like there's too much contrast and highlighting in it, too much detail, And I noticed sometime during my last editing of it that something weird had gone on with the hair here. With certain things that you do in Photoshop, especially when you have lots of complicated things going on, lots of different layers, and smart objects in particular, sometimes Photoshop will, I've noticed anyway, sort of glitch out a little bit, or doesn't render things properly, or doesn't re-render after you've changed some things. And I think that's what's happened here, but I'm not too bothered at the moment because I don't like her hair anyway, and I'm actually going to undo or just hide all the layers that I did for her hair. Now, the main reason for me doing that is simply because, like I mentioned, I felt that her hair stood out way too much. It didn't match with the background at all. And so I wanted to go back to how her hair was in the original photo and to see, you know, how that looks in my background. And in my opinion, it does look much more realistic now. So it's quite possible that when I made this brighter, this new piece of hair that I put in, that I should not have done that. I mean, that's not a problem, and going back and forth like this is something that does happen, especially with more complicated composites. You know, like as you edit, different things change or things come about that you hadn't originally thought of doing, and that influences everything else that you might have done. What I'm going to do, I'm going to double click on my second image, that is the new version of the hair, and I'm actually going to revert probably all of these edits that I did in Camera Raw and in Lightroom originally. I'm just going to set that back to default. So now when I do that and I hit OK, her hair now, you know, it's a lot darker, and it might be a little too dark now. Yeah, too dark now, definitely. But it is sort of a little bit more blended into the background. So I'm going to double click and go back into Camera Raw, because I can do this because I opened it as a smart object. And I might just increase the exposure. Let's just try that. Okay, now while I'm at it, I'm going to disable the layer mask. So all the curves, adjustment layers that I added earlier are kind of throwing me off as well, so I just toggled those off. So now you can see that it does look a lot more, the new piece of hair that I added in does look a lot more natural and similar to the original photo. So now that I have decreased the brightness on it, I'm actually going to try and see if I can blend her skin from the new photo in with her face here. And to do that, I'm going to use the brush tool on a white foreground to bring back, to make visible more of this layer. Now it's not obviously perfect. To see kind of roughly where this layer is positioned, I am going to reduce the opacity just so I can see where it sort of lines up with Courtney herself from the original photo. It's a little bit hard to tell, but I think, just going off my own judgment, I think it probably needs to be rotated a little bit. So I'm going to select that new top layer and just going to rotate it a little. Something that helps with lining things up, I mean her head is not tilted in quite the same way as it was in the original photo, but I can still sort of use parts of her facial features, like her eyebrows, to sort of try and line up her face a little bit. So if I go back and turn the opacity down, I can use the move tool now and just see if I can put the top layer and line up, you know, her eyes and her eyebrows, and that should line up her ear more accurately with the side of her face there. So that's already, seems like it's a lot better. I'm going to change the opacity back to 100%, and we're going to try and just blend the edges in. So you can see that her skin from this top layer, just because I reduced the brightness of this, like the exposure of this image, it is blending in nicer with the original photo underneath. There's just a little bit of stuff with her shoulder here that is not going to blend in nicely. So what I would do, well, there's a couple of things I can do. So her arm, obviously down here, is not going to line up at all because it's just in a completely different angle, so I'm not going to use that part. Sorry, I know this is hard to follow along because the two different images are quite similar, but please bear with me. Her shoulder doesn't look right there, so I'm probably going to keep her shoulder from the original photo and just going to hide everything from the new piece of hair that I put in. Unfortunately, that means that I'm going to have to probably hide her ear. So I actually think that's not looking too bad. I'm pretty okay with that. I think I will actually delete these other layers that I did before. So I'm just going to select them all and drag them to the trash bin. You can also see parts of the wall showing through her hair on this edge. I believe that some of that is in the bottom layer, down here in particular. So I have selected that layer mask, and again, just freehand with the brush tool on black, I'm just going to paint over that. It looks like there's a little bit of the wall still here, but that's actually on the background itself. So that is playing a little bit of a trick with my eyes. I don't need to worry too much about this edge because it's being hidden by the other piece of hair, the other hair image that I put in. However, you can see on this layer as well that there is pieces of wall here, and the way I'm going to deal with that actually is using liquify again. I'm actually going to make her hair come out a little bit further. So with my hair layer selected, I'm going up to filter, liquify, zoom in, and forward warp tool, and I'm just going to bump her hair out like this a little bit, a little bit. And hit OK and see what happens. This is another thing that I have yet to get to. Courtney, especially down here on the floor where she's standing, Courtney is a lot sharper than the background, and that's something I also need to address. And so what I will be doing actually is adding a little bit of a blur to Courtney. I might actually do that now even. So I'm gonna look at her feet because that is the most obvious sort of place where there's a distinction. So because Courtney is on, I imported this image as a smart object, I can actually apply a blur filter in a non-destructive way. If Courtney's layer was not a smart object, if you were going to apply a blur filter, it would actually blur that layer destructively, so that I wouldn't be able to undo it or adjust it again later. But because she's a smart object, I can apply a bit of a Gaussian blur, and 3 is obviously too much, so I'm just going to drop that down. Try 1. 1 is looking pretty reasonable, so I'm going to hit OK. And when I do that, you can see this little extra symbol on your layer, these 2 circles, and a drop down arrow. So I can click on that, and now I can see that my Gaussian blur filter that I just applied is sitting right here. And that means that I can double click on this and come back into the Gaussian blur and change this to anything that I need it to be. Like I said, if my layer my image layer here had not been a smart object, I would not be able to come back into this Gaussian blur and re-edit it. Now you can see though that there is a stronger white line around Courtney. This is something that tends to happen when you're blurring things. So I'll have to refine my selection further, and that is another reason why you really shouldn't be too fussy about your selections in the beginning, because you usually have to come back and change them again later. Now as I go up, particularly with her arms here, and definitely with her face, she is looking way too blurry up here, especially if you compare her to the background. So to remove the blur, when the smart filter was added, when the Gaussian blur was added, it produced this layer mask just for the filters. So I can use that just as a normal layer mask to just brush off and hide the Gaussian blur. So if I come and zoom right in so you can see, I can use my brush on black and make sure this smart filter white box is selected. And I'm going to drop my opacity down to 30%. Increase my brush size using the right angle bracket. I'm just going to brush that blur effect off her face. By the way, to switch between your foreground color and your background color, the shortcut key for that is X. You can see it's come up in the tooltip there. Switch foreground and background color is X. So you hit X and the two things will flip around. That is something to always check though, that you are actually on the right foreground color. And with composites, you'll find it really does not matter to have a really sharp image, especially if you are going to do a bit more of an artsy sort of creative edit, because a lot of the filters and textures and color changes and things that you do with the more creative art composites, it's going to soften the image anyway. So yeah, the most important thing is just to make sure that the two images, your subject and your background, actually blend together. And if one image is blurrier than the other, then you have to add blur to the sharper image, because sharpening a blurry image usually is not something you can feasibly do. If it's a little bit blurry, then you can, but if it's significantly blurry, it's not something that you can recover. Same thing goes with noise. If there was a lot of grain in the background, which it doesn't look like there is, I would also want to add grain to Courtney, but I think that the grain on Courtney is pretty well roughly the same. Oh yes, I forgot also to toggle back on all my curves adjustments on Courtney. This one is a little too bright now, so I'm actually going to just reduce the opacity of that. It's quite a subtle change. A lot of the changes with composites tend to be more on the subtle end, but it kind of comes out of staring at an image too long. So if you do start doing that, it's probably a good idea to actually take a break. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is try to fix up that selection, that white edge you can see there around Courtney. I'm actually going to manually just remove that edge using the brush tool. As I mentioned, doing the selections and making sure your edge is good is one of the most tedious, frustrating parts of doing compositing. I'm trying to, when I use the brush to do this, I try to get a hardness that sort of matches the edge, so that when I brush, you know, it's not like at 100% hardness. But usually 100% hardness, you don't want that. It's just, you know, obviously makes too hard of an edge. But you also don't want too soft a hardness, because then that also looks wrong. So make sure that you have your layer mask selected that you want to edit. And you really just need to play around with it until you get something that looks right. And then just brush away parts of your layer mask. You can change, obviously, the shape of your brush. I usually keep it as an oval myself, because I find that having a pointed edge to it makes a lot of things easier, but I know a lot of people just use the round default brush, and some people even use you know, some of these other more fancy brush strokes, but I find that using an oval of some sort and just adjusting the thickness of it, that works fine for me. As I also said earlier, if you have graphics tablets, definitely feel free to use them for this sort of stuff. You'll probably find it easier than trying to use the mouse. I use the mouse because I have been doing this for so long that I have pretty good control over it. I also have my mouse sensitivity to be quite low. Having it really quite at a low sensitivity helps with being able to draw with it as well. Okay, so that's looking a lot better. I'm going to do a bit on her skirt here as well. Another thing you can do if you're having trouble actually just freehanding the edge, if you go to your layer mask, you can control click on your layer mask and it will bring up the selection. Once that happens, you can then go to select and modify and contract the edge, and this will actually bring your selection edge in by a number of pixels that you specify. So this is a bit of a trial and error. I'm just going to pick 2 pixels for this image, and you can see that now my selection edge is actually just slightly within the skirt of Courtney here. And currently Courtney is selected, and I want to actually brush out on the other side of this selection. So I'm going to go up to select and inverse, so that now if I zoom out, you'll see everything but Courtney is selected right now. So zooming back in, again the selection edge is still not right along that edge of her skirt. Now I can use the brush tool on black on my layer mask of Courtney just to get rid of that white line there without having to worry as much about how accurate my mouse precision is. So if I go back to her skirt now, I'm going to deselect the selection, Control D, Command D on Mac, and if I go back, you can see that, hopefully on the video you can see that white edge there on the edge of her skirt, but now, after what I did, now it's gone. Okay, my main thing I'm looking at right now is colour. So I did make those colour adjustments, so this is the original colour. It was very green and yellow, and this is the current colour right now after my adjustments, taking those green yellow tones out. This is where we get a bit more creative. The colour lookup adjustment layer here is basically a set of presets, colour presets that you can apply to your image. So if you go to the Load 3D LUT drop down, you can see that there's a whole bunch of colour presets here. If you don't know what you're looking for, you can just literally go through the list and see if you get anything that jumps out at you. Now, obviously a lot of these are way overboard. They are just looking terrible and awful. So you never usually want to just apply them as they are. So you just need to adjust your opacity, reduce it way down, usually about 20% or so, depending what you want to apply. Certainly you don't only have to do one color lookup adjustment layer. You can stack them just by adding another one on top. But I'm going to keep going down through these. See, even adding more contrast kind of, it appeals to me because I like contrasty images usually. I like my images to be vibrant and contrasty and more dramatic. But like I said, for this image, I don't think I really want that. So this fall colours is kind of nice, just because it makes things look a lot softer and warmer and prettier. I'm just going to keep going through the list. I have an idea of what I'm looking for, but I am just going through everything to show all of you who are watching. So when you see something you like, absolutely, hide the adjustment and turn it back on again, just so you can compare before and after. I do this absolutely all the time. Whenever I make edits, I'm constantly comparing before and after to make sure that the change I have made is actually better than what was there originally. So I'm kind of thinking I will apply this bleach bypass, and I'm going to use a brush and just brush off on the layer mask certain areas where I think it's too bright. So I think up here is a bit too bright. I do like the window being extra bright. I like that it has reduced a lot of the yellows in the wall. I really don't like the yellow that is in these old style walls. And I do think that has made a big difference, that layer mask. I'm going to apply another color lookup preset. Is it fall colors, perhaps, and reduce the opacity down. And that kind of just softens, gives more warmth. If I just toggle both of those off, and you can go back to the original and come back, I do feel like that is an improvement. However, I don't want this warmer set of preset colors to be on the background. I really want it just coming from the window to mimic the warmer light coming through. So using my brush on a black ground color, I'm going to paint black on my layer mask and paint it off. Now if I hide that fall colors, you can see that the light on Courtney is a lot warmer and the light from the window looks a lot warmer. And if I toggle off the layer mask, you can see the effect that has had as well. I think I might have removed too much of the layer mask, so I'm actually going to decrease the density, which is like the opacity of the layer mask, just to bring a little bit of warmth, just a little bit of warmth back around the edges. And I feel like that is looking pretty good. Now things are going to get a little bit more experimental. If I apply another color lookup layer and go to, let's say, foggy night, if I switched this to soft light and reduce the opacity way down, I kind of like what that's doing to the background, like the background wall. It has darkened it, and foggy night also adds a bit of blue, but I'm going to brush it off the front part of my image. So you can see there, that's made quite a difference to the background. I actually definitely am liking that change. I just feel like Courtney stands out more. So it's also bring contrast back into this image, which I didn't really want to do. So I'm going to apply a curves adjustment layer. So basically I'm moving the points on the graph around until I get something that, I feel like is not too bad. So I don't really mind this. So for me, because Courtney's pose and expression is on the sadder side, that is why I'm doing more of a washed out effect on it. But certainly for what a lot of you guys did, don't feel like you have to do this washed out effect unless you like it. I think some of your images that you got of Courtney was had more of a stronger mood to them. She was flicking her skirts out and whatnot, so just keep that in mind when you're doing your creative edits, but by all means play around with different effects. You'd be surprised at what just playing around and trying things does, honestly. So if I toggle off some of my previous adjustments that I made, you can definitely see how much they have improved this image. So I'm just increasing the opacity of this color lookup adjustment layer, the foggy night one, just to see really what the effect has if it's stronger. This is obviously too strong at 100%, so I'm going to go back and undo that. But like, I certainly don't mind having it much darker behind Courtney, so I may actually try to adjust that further, and instead of adjusting the color lookup adjustment layer that I did, I am going to just use a new curves layer so that I don't have to affect that. Then I'm going to change it to luminosity so it doesn't affect the colors. Then I'm going to invert this mask, so I'm going to go to my masks properties, invert, and I'm just going to paint it in on this side. So if I switch that off and on again, you do see what a difference that has made, and I'm feeling pretty good about this now. Let's see, the only thing, I don't really like how Courtney's hair is blending into the background. Not sure if there's really too much I can do about that, short of, you know, actually making it brighter. Now, if I wanted to be really creative with this, like, I feel pretty happy with this image as an image right now, but if I wanted to be really creative with it, I might consider putting some light beams into this image. And just quickly to see, I'm going to use an exposure adjustment layer to do that. And with the layer mask selected, I'm going to actually invert in my properties panel for the layer mask. I'm going to invert that layer mask, and I'm going to make my adjustment to be brighter, and I'm going to use, obviously you can't see the adjustment that I just made because my layer mask is completely black right now, but I'm going to use the brush tool on white, and with a really big brush I'm just going to, just for experiment's sake, I'm going to just draw in roughly where I think light could be streaming in from this window. So it's going to be coming down like this. I'm probably going to want a bit more of an angle and a bit of a softer brush, so I'm going to change the opacity down to 30% and just feather it out like so. Alright, now obviously this is affecting contrast and colours and things, which I don't really like. It's taken away some of my matte effect, so I'm going to adjust the offset to bring more of a washed out feel to it, and to get rid of the contrast I can adjust gamma correction. If I go to the left and reduce some of the offsets and make it a bit less bright as well. So doing that, you know, it kind of gives you a really quick look at what a bit of a light beam, light haze might look like. If you want to add more drama, you know, that's one way of doing it. This is a bit too strong in my opinion, so I'm going to switch to a black brush and actually at 50% just get rid of some of the light beam at the bottom of the frame and also directly behind her, because she would be casting a bit, somewhat of a shadow if this was actually, but that's too much. So I'm going to reduce my opacity down and just brush it off directly behind her. You really only get light beams if the air is really dusty and hazy, but that is a quick way of doing it, just to see. I mean, I kind of like the drama that it's adding, but ultimately it's too much. The effect is too strong. I suppose that's not too bad. I might need to adjust things a little. Like, I kind of like this effect, but at the same time, there's something about it that I don't like. I can try to add another preset with a low opacity. I'm not sure how I feel about that, honestly. It's almost a little bit, like trying too hard almost. That's kind of the feeling that I get. I don't know how you guys feel about it. But it does seem to be adding something. There is something there that I am kind of liking, which I suspect is literally just the fact that it centers the brighter point of the frame around Courtney more. Because when I toggle it off, you can see that this part of the image, like the door at the top, it is kind of bright, and it does pull the eye up that way, whereas once I toggle this on, I feel like the eye is drawn more towards Courtney, and there's like a dark strip here. And honestly, with composites, like, you could keep going forever, and if you are not careful, you can keep going so long that you actually go past the point of having something good, and so everything afterwards is actually making things worse. So I may actually just throw these two different versions up on social media and see what people think. See if they have preference. Getting feedback is always a good thing, so usually I will come back to it and do more edits or change things, and I may yet still, but for the sake of this video I think I will stop it right here. I did end up putting this image up onto Facebook into a Photoshop group that I find really helpful for giving feedback about composites. It is called Photoshop and Photography. If you guys want to join it, I will put the link in the video description. And after I got that feedback, I came back in and I did a whole lot of editing, and I ended up with this version right here. I'm a lot happier with this one. Just overall the colors are a lot better, and I feel like Courtney is much more the focus of the image. Unfortunately, I didn't record the editing that I did to get it to this point, simply because, you know, a lot of it was playing around and trying different things and somewhat more experimental. But I do apologize for not recording it. I probably should have done that anyway. So I'm just going to quickly compare the two images. The first thing that you will notice is just the colors. The colors in this version is not only a whole lot nicer, but also I feel like it is more cohesive across both Courtney and the background, whereas this one, the colors didn't really feel very pleasant, and just between Courtney and the background, like it doesn't really gel well together, in my opinion. The other thing that I did, I cropped it in more so that the focus really does come straight to Courtney and the door is far less distracting. So I just wanted to show you all the updated version and the final version of this image. I encourage you all to give compositing a go and actually post your work up onto that Facebook group. You'll get a lot of valuable feedback on that group, and you can also contact me as well, of course. So thanks for watching this video. I hope that you managed to get through all of it okay, and that, you know, you could pick something up from it. I usually do record my edits when I'm doing composites. Occasionally I will do a voiceover explaining what I'm doing more often. So feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel if that is something you're interested in. And I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with in the future.